For the last few months, I've been obsessed with the idea of turning clay into glass and making an impossible pottery piece that is somewhere between porcelain and glass. You see, porcelain contains silica, so if you can get it paper thin and fire it at over 1200 degrees Celsius, you have a chance of turning porcelain into glass. At least, in theory. I tried previously to create a Chinese lantern out of porcelain. The piece took over 2 weeks of work, but discolored, cracked, warped, and ultimately didn't turn into glass. After spending so long only to fail, I started to question, is this even possible? To prove that it was even possible to achieve glass levels of translucency with my porcelain, I made a small candle holder that I threw, trimmed, and carved, then glazed in a white crystalline glaze. When I brought the fired version to the light, it worked, and it was stunning. This proved that I could do it with a small piece, but I knew doing it with a large piece would be much, much harder. The larger the piece, the thicker the walls need to be, and the greater the outward force on the piece as it spins on the wheel, so it's much harder to control and throw. So now the question is it even possible to throw a large piece this thin, or would I slave away for another 2 weeks in the studio only for it to end in heartbreak? After my successful test, I made a second lantern, trying this time to really get the piece thinner. Throwing large pieces of porcelain like this requires a lot of patience. Porcelain is a less elastic clay, so it doesn't pull as easily as stonewares or earthenwares. It is much more stiff and doesn't move as much when you pull it. It is also weaker, so you cannot use as much water or else your porcelain will turn to mush and collapse. This porcelain is particularly interesting because it's a dark gray, not the usual stark white porcelain is known for. When it fires though, it turns white even after the first bisque firing. After throwing it to the height I needed, I pushed the clay into the wooden rib, compressing the piece. I had to be careful not to push too much or I would bow the walls out. Even as I was pulling this porcelain, I could tell it wasn't quite as thin as I was hoping. As I collared in, there was too much clay that was getting pushed into the collar, and I knew that I would need to trim off a lot to even come close to succeeding in my challenge. Once I collared in and took a ring off, I was able to wire it off, preparing to trim it the next day. This would be when I would really get it to the thickness I wanted. To try to get it as thin as I could, I trimmed down the walls repeatedly for over 20 minutes, hoping that by the time I cut it open to see the actual width of the base, it would be thin enough to have a chance of succeeding. The goal was to leave enough width in the walls that the two pieces could seamlessly connect to each other, but thin enough that carving the petals would let light shine through. I knew that it would be very difficult to get the entire piece thin enough to let light shine through the whole thing. The most practical way to make this kind of lantern, where the whole piece glows from the inside, is to cast it in a mold. Doing it this way, you can put a very, very thin layer of porcelain slip into a mold, let it dry, then add another thin layer, repeating this until you get the thickness you want. This is a really easy way to control the exact thickness of the piece. But I wanted to throw this piece on the wheel, so carving was my best option. I also could have carved the leaves out entirely, but I didn't want to be able to see the flame inside or have crazy shadows thrown out of the piece. I wanted the piece to have just the impression of a flame from the inside. And after seeing how beautiful they look when just some light shines through, via my cup experiment, I was determined to make carving the leaves work. By the time I finished trimming, penciled out the ginkgo leaves, and started carving, the piece was already a little too dry for my liking. But I got about 20% through the carving before leaving for the day. Unfortunately, after I left, the studio staff thought I had finished it and left it out to dry. By the time I came back the next day, it was way past leather hard, and I had to be very careful when carving as to not crack the piece. You can see how dry it is here by the color. It has lightened considerably since the trimming stage. Carving at this stage was precarious. It is much slower and more difficult to carve a piece thinly when it's so dry. Every layer has to be carefully taken out, and the chance for cracking is much higher, both from the force I have to use when carving and from the blade slicing into very dry clay. Patching any holes when it's this dry is also very difficult, and the clay dulls the trimming tools as well. If it can be avoided, it should be. I did what I could, sponging the clay moist so I could keep working on it and getting it as thin as I could. But I was definitely concerned that this wouldn't be thin enough. After it was bisque fired, I dipped it into the glaze to coat the piece. This time in a single color instead of painting the petals. Although the painted petals were beautiful, I felt like they did obstruct some light, and I was hoping for a more glass-like look on this piece. Once the glaze dried, I cleaned up some of the larger drippings to even out the glaze on the body. If this isn't done, the glaze can look extra thick in parts where it's dripped. And while some people don't mind this look, I prefer a more even layer of glaze. The tool I'm using is somewhere between a knife and a steel blade, and it works well for tasks like this one. Once I took it out of the kiln, though, I saw that the same warping that had happened on my first piece happened on this one. So again, it was time to take it to the Dremel. The moment of truth, though, was whether light would shine through. So I took it over to the lamp, and the answer was yes. For some of the leaves, especially in the top, the light shone through brilliantly. You can see the veining on the leaves, and the glow through the porcelain and celadon glaze is so beautiful. Unfortunately, when I tested it with a tea light, almost no light shone through. I could not count this a success.
Nope, nothing.
So I tried again. They say if at first you don't succeed, try again. I actually had to leave the studio the week after I threw this piece, so I knew I didn't have much time to finish the throwing, trimming, carving, and glazing of this piece. This would be my last chance at getting this to work. I threw this piece from reclaimed clay, which is clay that has been used before and re-wedged to make it usable again. This clay tends to be weaker and less consistent throughout, making it more difficult to throw. It is more pliable though, and can be easier to move large amounts more quickly because it's less stiff. In this case, it was definitely on the wet and soft side. And on my final pull started wobbling, which made me worried about getting it any thinner in case it collapsed. After getting it to the height I wanted, I took a wooden rib to the outside of it to straighten and compress the walls, which makes them stronger, and also to take the slip off the outside. Taking the slip off helps the piece dry more quickly and evenly for trimming, and prevents the clay from weakening as it dries. Then I collared in at the top and thinned out the mouth and shoulder. While I can continue to thin different parts of the body in trimming, I prefer to thin out the piece while throwing if I can. Once the shape was complete, I wired it off, then used dry hands to grasp the piece and lift, spreading my hands to distribute the pressure as much as possible. The next day, I came back and knew I had to take at least 2 millimeters off the sides. Even though I would be carving, hopefully supremely thinly this time, I wanted to get the sides as thin as possible so that carving would be a bit easier. I also wanted to make the shape a bit more angular, so I trimmed the shoulder to be a little bit more sloped, and then trimmed a bit off the top as well. Once I felt like the shape was where I wanted it, the sides were straight enough and the piece was thin enough, it was time to separate the top from the bottom. I used the same knife tool as I did to remove the glaze to carve into the body, and then gently dug in until the clay was fully separated. Once the tool had gone all the way through, I took the top off the bottom and then began to trim the join. I also decided this time that instead of creating the latch from the edges of the piece, I would leave the top part of the piece as is, then add an inner ring to the bottom so that the top piece could have a thicker base to sit on. I hope that this would prevent warping in the final firing. Once upside down, I was able to trim the foot into the bottom. I really wanted a foot here because if a candle is to sit on the inside of this piece, I didn't want the heat of the candle heating the clay and therefore the table underneath it. If I had had more time, I probably would have made an even taller foot, adding clay to the foot ring I carved out here to further elevate it. Once I finished leveling off the bottom and trimming out the foot, I stamped my maker's mark and moved on to trimming the top. Looking down into this top piece, you can see how thick the edges were, at least down here at the base, before I trimmed some of the inside away. My goal was to get the walls to be as thin as possible but still structurally sound, then carve 70% of that away. That's how thin I was aiming to get the leaves, with the parts between the veins even thinner, up to 90%. This would all come down to the carving. Before starting to carve, I roughly sketched where the petals would go. This was my first time drawing on such wet clay. I had historically done this step when the piece was much more dry, and the pencil left indentations all over my piece. This was a problem because I freehand draw the leaves, and sometimes after I'm finished sketching where I want them to go, I change my mind about the positioning of some of them. So when I go to make the actual carvings, the indentations left don't perfectly match where I actually decide to carve out the leaves. So I had to be very careful about smoothing over the pencil lines after I was finished carving, but I'm not sure I got all of them out. I also found that the wet piece could easily warp in my hands if I wasn't careful. While I had used a foam block under my work before, it was particularly useful for this carving. The foam allows me to secure the piece, pressing into the foam without worrying about it leaving indentations as a table would. It also allows me to set the piece down and still work on it. Holding a piece like this for hours can be very exhausting and straining on the wrist, so it's important to have a soft spot to set the piece down on. These thick foam blocks are really great for that. As I carve, I use a few different tools. The first is a more triangular, pointed tool that helps define the stems and the edges of the petals. This is also the one that goes over the piece at the end to define the veins in the leaves. Where this tool deepens, the light will shine through more. The second tool is a rounded tool that scoops out more clay and helps with the rounded nature of the petals. After I mark the edges of the petals, I use this tool to take out clay more effectively. I tend to start from the outside of the petal and work in when initially defining the leaf. I find that this helps me dig deeper in places I'm less worried about poking a hole through, because I don't go over that spot as many times. Then, once the outside of the petal is defined, I refine the inside with both the looped and pointed tools until I get it to the thinness that I want. As I go, I test the thickness of the petals I can reach, those on the outer edges, squeezing between my fingers to see if they're thin enough. Unless it feels almost like my fingers are touching through the clay, the petals aren't thin enough. I have to be careful though. When it gets to this thinness, any wrong carving with these trimming tools will poke a hole and ruin the aesthetic I'm going for. Unfortunately, because I had to leave in under a week, I had to rush and couldn't quite get it to the thinness I wanted. I felt that some parts were still too thick, but there was no way to know until the piece has been fired. If I tried to shine a flashlight through the clay body at this point, no light would pass through. It's still just clay. I would only find out if I had trimmed and carved well enough after I took it out of the final glaze firing. This is the beauty and pain of porcelain. After bisque firing, I sanded down the piece and glazed it in the same blue Celadon as the previous one. I love how that color turned out and hoped that this would be the better version of that. After taking this lantern out of the kiln, it was the penultimate test. Would light shine through this piece? Holding my breath, I held the piece up to a light in the studio. And it worked! The light shines through every petal, and the veining pattern is brilliant. I am absolutely in love with the glaze, the pattern, and the piece. The true final test, however, was with a tea light. This small candle produces much less light than a light bulb, and I had never passed this test. Our studio manager, Andrew, lit the tea light with his ridiculously cool lighter, and we turned off the lights. I was on a flight out of the country the next day, so this was it. As the lights went out, I could see the pattern come to life. I had done it! Once we closed the windows, I was stunned by how beautiful the piece was. It was even more beautiful than I imagined it would be, and it was definitely one of the most striking things I have ever made. What do you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.